We build walls against the chaos of the world, fortresses of routine and distraction. We fill our lives with noise, with light, with sensation, a constant, comforting barrage that reassures us of our own existence. But what if the ultimate truth, the bedrock of reality, isn't found in the clamor, but in its absolute absence? What if, by stripping away everything that makes us who we are, we uncover not peace, but a silence that listens back? Tonight, on Shadow Dispatch, we delve into the classified legacy of the Resonance Institute and the terrifying pursuit of what they called the Attenuation Doctrine. Dr. Eris Thorne prided himself on his resilience to silence. It was, after all, his life's work. The Resonance Institute, a name that whispered of breakthroughs in human consciousness, was his domain, or at least the small windowless corner of it where he analyzed the fragmented testimonies of those who had brushed against the void. For years, the Institute's official charter spoke of mitigating the adverse effects of sensory deprivation, of helping astronauts and deep-sea explorers maintain their sanity in the crushing emptiness, a noble pursuit, publicly funded, meticulously documented. But Eris knew the truth, the Institute's shadowed heart, Chamber Zero. It wasn't merely a room, it was an ambition, a meticulously engineered abyss designed to achieve total sensory negation, not just anechoic, but an everythic. No light, no sound, no smell, no thermal variance, no discernible tactile feedback. Even the air was filtered to a degree that removed the subtle scent of its own composition. Subjects floated in a saline solution precisely matching body temperature, their ears plugged, their eyes sealed. The goal, as outlined in the classified Attenuation Doctrine by the Institute's enigmatic founder, Director Alastair Finch, was to strip away the cognitive static, the relentless chatter of the self, until only pure awareness remained, capable of something else. Eris was a data analyst, a cartographer of fractured minds. He'd never been inside Chamber Zero. His role was to sift through the post-immersion debriefs, the EEG readings, the hushed, often incoherent ramblings of subjects who'd spent mere hours, sometimes only minutes, within its perfect darkness. Most reported the usual: disorientation, hallucinations born of a brain starved for input, a creeping sense of unease. But a few, a select few, hinted at more. "It's not empty," Subject 34B, a stoic, ex-military man, had whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes darting as if seeing phantoms in the sterile debriefing room. "It's attentive. I felt my thoughts being unthreaded," a philosopher, Subject 27G, had written, her hand shaking so violently the pen tore the paper. Finch, a man whose presence was as attenuated as the silence he sought, dismissed these as predictable psychological artifacts. "The mind abhors a vacuum, Thorne," he'd say, his voice a dry rustle. "It populates the void with its own ghosts." Eris wasn't so sure. He'd noticed a pattern in the anomalous reports, a subtle convergence, the attentive quality, the feeling of thoughts not just dissolving, but being drawn out. And then there were the silences within the silences, moments in the recordings where subjects would fall utterly quiet, not in sleep, but in a state the sensors registered as intense, almost paralytic focus. After these lacunae, their coherence would invariably shatter. The latest subject, a linguist named Dr. Lena Hansen, Subject 41C, was supposed to be the breakthrough. Her expertise in the deep structures of language, Finch believed, made her uniquely equipped to articulate the experience, to bring back a map of that primordial silence. Eris had reservations. Hansen possessed a keen, almost uncomfortably perceptive intellect, but also a fragility he'd seen in her pre-assessment psychological profiles. He sat in his cramped office, the hum of the Institute's climate control a dull drone against the quiet thrum of his unease. On his monitor, Hansen's biometric data streamed live from the antechamber of Chamber 0. Heart rate steady, respiration even. She was undergoing the final stages of preparation, the sensory neutralization, the careful lowering into the suspension tank. A soft chime indicated Finch entering the observation deck overlooking the antechamber. Eris switched to the visual feed. Finch stood, a silhouette against the dim glow of control panels, watching as Hansen, pale and small in her minimalist immersion suit, was sealed into the pod that would convey her into 0. The process was always unsettling to Eris. It was so reductive, stripping away humanity layer by layer, like peeling an onion down to nothingness. Hansen was in. Chamber 0 was sealed. Now there was only the data. Hours passed. Eris watched the lines on his screen, the subtle fluctuations of Hansen's vitals. The usual initial spike of anxiety, then a gradual settling. Her EEG showed brain activity slowing, moving towards theta waves, the twilight state between waking and sleep. This was normal. Then, 3 hours and 17 minutes in, the first anomaly. A brief, sharp spike in Hansen's heart rate, accompanied by a burst of high-frequency brain activity, almost like a seizure, but too localized, too specific. It lasted only seconds, then subsided. Finch, Eris knew, would be watching his own monitors, his expression unreadable. Eris leaned closer, his own heart quickening. He opened the audio channel from Hansen's internal microphone, a last resort, as even the faintest sound could compromise the doctrine's purity. It was meant for emergencies. For now, it was silent, save for the barely perceptible rhythm of her breathing. Another hour crawled by. The Institute around Eris felt unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. He found himself straining his ears, listening for something beyond the hum of machinery, a foolish impulse. The silence he studied was contained, an artificial construct. Or was it? The second anomaly was more profound. Hansen's EEG flatlined, not in the pattern of brain death, but in a way that suggested cessation, as if all neuroactivity had simply paused. Simultaneously, her heart rate dropped to a perilous low. "Director," Eris spoke into his comm, his voice tight. "Subject 41C is showing critical biosign divergence. I recommend immediate extraction." Finch's reply was a moment delayed, cool and measured. "Patience, Dr. Thorne. We are at a precipice. Attenuation is not a gentle process. Her neural activity is non-existent, Director. This isn't attenuation, it's—" "Observe, Thorne," Finch cut in, his voice carrying an unusual intensity. "Observe the silence she has found." Eris stared at the flat lines, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. This wasn't in any of the projections. He felt a prickle on his skin, the absurd notion that the silence from Chamber 0 was leaking, pressing against the walls of the Institute. Then, on the audio feed, A sound. It wasn't Hansen. It was a whisper, so faint it was almost subliminal, like the rustle of dry leaves in a vast empty space. But there were no leaves in Chamber Zero, no air currents to stir them. The whisper was sibilant, and it seemed to be inhaling. Eris felt the hairs on his arms stand up. "Director, did you hear that?" No response. He glanced at the visual feed to the observation deck. Finch was still there, but he was leaning forward, pressed against the reinforced glass, his posture rigid. The EEG lines on Hansen's display twitched. Not back to life, not in any recognizable pattern, but more like interference, jagged, alien spikes. And then her voice, low, guttural, devoid of its usual cadence. "It sees." Eris recoiled from his monitor. That wasn't Hansen's voice. The timbre was wrong, the resonance deeper, hollow. "It sees the spaces between." The voice paused, and the sibilant whispering returned, louder this time, accompanied by a soft, wet clicking. "Finch!" Eris yelled into the comm. "Pull her out, now!" On the observation deck feed, Finch didn't move. He seemed transfixed. Hansen's voice came again, stronger, colder. "The patterns are unmaking. I am unmaking." Eris slammed his hand on the emergency extraction override. Warning lights flashed across his console, but the sequence didn't initiate. System locked. He tried again. Locked. Finch must have disabled it from the observation deck. "Director, what are you doing?" Eris shouted, his voice raw with panic. He scrambled from his chair, intending to race to the antechamber controls himself, but a new sound froze him. It was coming from his own office speakers, though the audio feed from Chamber Zero was supposedly one way. A low thrum, like a vast, impossibly deep bass note that he felt more in his bones than heard with his ears. The lights in his office flickered. The hum of the climate control died, plunging the room into an unnerving quiet, broken only by that terrible, resonant thrum. And Hansen's voice, now impossibly close, as if she were standing behind him. "The silence hungers." Eris stared at his monitor. Hansen's biometric data was still flatlined, yet her voice filled his office. The EEG was a chaotic scrawl of noise. He felt a pressure in his ears, a dizzying disorientation. His own thoughts felt sticky, slow. He tried to focus, to think of escape, of the manual overrides in the central control, but the path there seemed impossibly complex, his memories of the Institute's layout blurring. The sibilant whispering was louder now, seeming to emanate from the corners of his room, from the shadows beneath his desk. He could feel a cold draft, though the ventilation was off. "It wants the anchor." Hansen's voice rasped, now tinged with something that might have been her own terror, struggling beneath the alien monotone. "The self." Eris felt a profound internal shift. A wave of nausea, yes, but more than that, a detachment. He looked at his own hand, resting on the console. It seemed distant, unfamiliar. The intricate network of thoughts, memories, anxieties that constituted Aris Thorne felt thinner, less substantial, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. He remembered Finch's words. "The mind abhors a vacuum. It populates the void with its own ghosts." But what if the void itself was the ghost? What if it wasn't empty, but waiting? The thrumming sound intensified, and with it a new sensation, a pulling, not physical, but psychic, as if his consciousness were a tethered balloon and something was methodically cutting the strings. He thought of Subject 27G, thoughts unthreaded. He had to get to Finch. He had to stop this. But the thought of Finch now evoked a strange blankness. Finch? Who was Finch? The name was a sound, empty of association. He stumbled towards the door, his limbs heavy, his perception wavering. The corridor outside his office was dark, the emergency lights flickering erratically. The usual sounds of the institute, the distant hum of machinery, the soft footfalls of personnel, were gone. Replaced by nothing. A profound, unnatural stillness that pressed in on him. No, not nothing. Beneath the stillness, the thrum, and the whispering. Closer now. He fumbled his way towards central control, each step a monumental effort of will. His name, Eris Thorne, echoed faintly in his mind, a fading beacon. He clung to it. I am Eris Thorne. I work at the Resonance Institute. I must stop this. The corridors seemed to shift, to lengthen. Familiar junctions became alien. He was lost, not just in the building, but within himself. The details of his life, his past, his motivations, they were like sand slipping through his fingers. What was he trying to do? Why was he here? There was an urgency, a fear, but its source was becoming opaque. He saw a flicker of movement at the end of a hallway, a shape, vaguely human, but too tall, too thin. It retreated into the shadows before he could properly see it. Or had he imagined it? The darkness here felt populated. The thrumming vibrated through the floor, through his teeth. The whispering was a chorus now, a symphony of dry, sibilant breaths all around him. He covered his ears, but the sound wasn't external. It was inside his head, woven into the fabric of his dissolving thoughts. He finally reached the main control room. The door was ajar. Inside, it was chaos. Consoles sparked, screens displayed static or cryptic symbols he didn't recognize. And in the center of the room, by the primary console for Chamber 0, stood Finch. He was facing away from Eris, towards the large schematic of the chamber. But he wasn't looking at it. His head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, his body rigid. A soft, rhythmic clicking emanated from him. "Finch?" Eris managed, his voice a dry croak. His own name felt distant now, almost someone else's. Finch slowly turned. His eyes were wide, perfectly black, reflecting no light. His jaw was slack, and the clicking sound came from his teeth, chattering with a slow, deliberate rhythm. A thin trickle of dark fluid ran from the corner of his mouth. The aperture, Finch's voice, was a grotesque parody of his usual dry tone, now wet, gurgling. It requires resonance. He took a step towards Eris, his movements jerky, puppet-like. The thrumming in the room pulsed, and Eris felt another wave of his own identity shear away. His memories of his childhood, his education, his reasons for joining the Institute, gone, reduced to faint, abstract notions. "We offered silence," Finch gurgled, advancing. "It offers communion." Aris backed away, his mind screaming, even as his capacity for coherent thought dwindled. He knew, with a primal certainty that bypassed intellect, that this communion was utter annihilation, the dissolution of self into that, the attentive void. He bumped against a security panel. An idea, a flicker of the old Aris surfaced. The emergency containment protocol. A total lockdown, severing all power, flooding critical areas with suppressant gas. Designed for catastrophic system failure or hostile entities. His fingers, clumsy and trembling, fumbled for the keypad. He could barely recall the access code. The numbers felt foreign. The whispering intensified, coiling around him, trying to pry open his fading mind. Focus. One number, then another. Finch was closer now, his black eyes fixed on Aris. The clicking of his teeth was louder, more insistent. "Join the chorus," Finch hissed, a gust of unnaturally cold air washing over Aris. The final number. He slammed his palm on the enter key. Alarms shrieked through the institute. Heavy steel doors began to thunder down, sealing off sections. The thrumming sound faltered, spiked violently, then began to recede, as if in pain or anger. Finch staggered, a low moan tearing from his throat, no longer articulate, just pure animalistic sound. The blackness in his eyes seemed to flicker. Aris collapsed against the wall, gasping. The pressure in his head lessened slightly. He could feel fragments, shards of himself, trying to recoalesce. The name Aris felt a little stronger. The gas, a milky white vapor, began to hiss into the control room. Finch thrashed, his limbs flailing. Then, slowly, he began to shrink, to fold in on himself, as if the structure holding him together was failing. The clicking stopped. He crumpled to the floor, a heap of clothes and something else. Something that seemed to seep away into the grates of the floor, like dark water. The alarms cut out. The emergency lights steadied. The building fell into a new kind of silence, heavy, chemical, and absolute. Aris lay there for a long time, shivering. He didn't know how much of himself was left. He felt scoured, hollowed out. Eventually, rescue teams arrived, clad in hazmat suits. They found him, curled up in the control room, barely responsive. Finch was gone, no trace. Chamber 0 was sealed, its systems inert. Dr. Lena Hansen, Subject 41C, was retrieved from the pod. Physically unharmed, but her mind. The official report would call it profound catatonia. She never spoke another word. Her eyes, they said, were like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing. Aris Thorne was extensively debriefed. He tried to explain what he had experienced, what he'd witnessed. The attentive silence, the unmaking, the thing that had looked through Finch's eyes. They nodded, took notes, and attributed it to acute stress, hypoxia from the compromised air systems, the psychological impact of the incident. The Attenuation Doctrine was buried, classified under layers of national security. The Resonance Institute was quietly, permanently decommissioned. But Aris knew. He knew that what they had sought in Chamber 0 wasn't an absence, but a presence. An intelligence that thrived in the utter void, a consciousness of pure silent hunger. And he knew that it was still out there, somewhere beyond the noise of the world, listening. He lives quietly now, in a small cottage far from any city. He surrounds himself with sound, music, television, the chatter of talk radio, the ticking of countless clocks. He cannot bear silence. Because in those moments, when the world stills, when the noise fades even for an instant, he can sometimes feel it. A faint pressure in his ears, a slowing of his thoughts, a cold, attentive presence at the very edge of his perception. And he remembers the last thing he heard from Chamber Zero, not from Hansen, not from Finch, but from the silence itself. A thought impressed directly into the fading core of his mind before the alarms saved him. We are patient. The fear lingers, not just for himself, but for a world so desperate to quiet the noise, so eager to find peace in the void. He wonders what else might be listening from the spaces between our thoughts, waiting for us to finally, fatally, achieve silence.